She ran through the snow, barefoot, bleeding, chased by men who wanted her to vanish forever. He found her in the woods, broken, silent, and unnamed, and carried her home without asking a single question. What he whispered that night didn't just make her cry. It gave her the miracle she never knew she needed. If stories of quiet courage, unexpected love, and the healing power of kindness speak to your heart, you're in the right place. Take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the moments that matter most. Now let me tell you what happened. In the cabin beneath her tears, the sky was a velvet curtain fading from dusk to something far darker than night. Above the tree line, a helicopter's fading rotor sound vanished like a lie swallowed by the wind. Somewhere beneath that disappearing sound, Serafina Voss was running for her life, barefoot, blood seeping through a ripped sleeve, and no idea how far danger was behind her, or ahead. Branches clawed at her like hands trying to drag her back. Her breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. Her designer blouse, white silk, now stained with dirt sweat, and a faint crimson stain near her shoulder, clung to her like a second skin. She didn't know how long she'd been stumbling through the forest, only that the GPS from her downed aircraft had blinked one last time before dying in her hand. No signal, no help, just trees. And somewhere in those trees, men with flashlights and dark intentions were closing in. She slipped hard down a shallow slope and landed against a fallen log, biting her lip to keep from crying out. Pain exploded in her ankle, twisted, maybe fractured. But she had no time to diagnose. Not when the woods behind her still echoed with the faint rhythm of boots, and what might have been the cold metallic clack of something she didn't want to imagine. Serafina Voss, once the headline-making elusive tech billionaire, had become a ghost in the pines. Miles away, a man was chopping wood. Each swing of the axe came down, clean, deliberate. Callum Greaves, 42, didn't do anything. Halfway, not work, not grief, not silence. A flannel shirt hung loose on his shoulders, sleeves rolled to the elbows, forearms scarred not from war, but from rescue. He paused mid-swing. The wind had shifted. In the stillness of the forest, there was something unnatural, a rhythm out of sync with the woods. Boots, not animals. Human. Running. One set of steps was frantic, the others methodical. Callum's brows furrowed. He turned to look toward the deeper edge of the forest. Something gnawed at his chest. Not curiosity. Instinct. The part of him that hadn't been used since he'd buried his wife and sworn off saving anyone again. Behind him, a small face appeared at the cabin window. His daughter, Lyra, age 9, pale and wide-eyed, even in the soft cabin light. He set the axe down and quietly grabbed the flashlight mounted under the porch rail. Without a word, he moved into the trees. Back in the pines, Serafina could go no further. Her leg gave out and she collapsed onto a patch of damp earth. Tears blurred her vision, but not from pain, from humiliation. This was not how her story was supposed to end. Not in silence, not in the dirt, not unseen. A sound snapped nearby, a dry twig under pressure. She froze, breath hitched. Her body trembled as she tried to brace herself, but the adrenaline was gone. All she had left was will, and it was fading. Then came the light, not the harsh, erratic kind from a flashlight in the wrong hands. This one moved slow, purposeful, cautious. "Hey," her voice cracked. "Over here," she coughed, her voice splintering like wood in the fire. The beam of light found her face. A man's silhouette approached, tall and steady. He crouched beside her without a word, eyes scanning her condition, not her worth. "Are they after you?" he asked quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. Her lips quivered. He didn't flinch, didn't ask who she was. Just reached down, pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her. Then, as effortlessly as if she were a child, he lifted her onto his back. The forest swallowed them. Behind them, the low crack of thunder echoed not from the sky, but from something man-made, metallic, and unmistakable to anyone who'd served in emergency rescue. Callum didn't run. He moved like he belonged to the woods, through a stream bed, over a narrow ridge, beneath a curtain of pine so dense it blocked out the sky. Every so often, Serafina would open her eyes against his back, clinging not out of fear, but from the first flicker of trust. Not because he asked anything of her, but because he hadn't. It was nearly dawn when they reached the cabin. Callum laid her gently on the old leather couch beside the fireplace. He glanced once toward the stairs. No movement. Lyra must have stayed in bed as she was told. He turned to Serafina, now semi-conscious, teeth chattering. He knelt beside her, tossed another log on the fire, and handed her a steaming mug of tea. She looked up at him, her voice barely audible. "You don't even know who I am." Callum's face was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Doesn't matter. You were running, and someone was chasing. That's all I need to know tonight." Then, with quiet certainty, he added, "You're safe now." The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, casting a golden glow across the rustic cabin walls. The scent of pine and old cedar hung in the air, blending with the subtle sweetness of the chamomile tea. Serafina barely touched. Her hands trembled more from exhaustion than fear. Now, but the image of dark shapes and silver gleams in the woods still haunted the corners of her eyes. Across the room, Callum Greaves sat silently at the wooden table, watching her, not with suspicion, not even curiosity, but with the calm awareness of someone who had seen the worst and still chose to sit quietly with it. Serafina's voice was barely above a whisper. "You didn't ask for my name." Callum didn't look up from the old knife he was sharpening against a leather strap. "Didn't need it." "Don't you want to know who I am?" He paused, his eyes finally meeting hers. Not tonight. There was no edge in his tone, no challenge, just a quiet refusal to treat her like a puzzle to be solved. It unsettled her more than any interrogation might have. For the first time in years, someone didn't want anything from Serafina Voss. Upstairs, tucked under a faded quilt stitched with stars and pine trees, Lyra Greaves lay awake, her small fingers curled around the edges of the blanket. She had seen the woman, pale injured, wrapped in her father's flannel jacket, and the way her father had carried her inside. Lyra didn't like strangers, especially women, especially ones who needed her father's help. She had lost too much already to risk losing the only piece she had left. Back downstairs, Serafina shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "You live here alone." Callum hesitated for the briefest second. "With my daughter." Serafina blinked. "I didn't see her. You weren't supposed to. She knows not to come down when someone new's in the house." Serafina nodded, then stared into the fire. "She's lucky to have you." Callum set the knife down gently. "I hope so." It wasn't pride that shaped his answer. It was something closer to doubt. Serafina recognized it. She wore the same tone whenever she talked about love, like it was something once close enough to touch, now stored in the attic of memory. Callum stood and moved to the kitchen. "You need food." He pulled a pot from the small pantry and placed it on the stove. "Something warm." "You look like you haven't eaten in days." "I haven't," Serafina admitted. "Since the crash." He looked up, his brow furrowing, but didn't ask. Instead, he turned the flame up and began slicing carrots and potatoes with practiced ease. Serafina watched his hands. They were strong, worn, careful, not the hands of a man who'd given up on life, though there was a tiredness behind every movement. She wondered if he had always been like this, or if something had broken him just enough to keep him quiet. She wrapped the flannel jacket tighter around her. "You knew how to move in the woods, like you'd done it 100 times." Callum gave a small nod. "Used to work search and rescue?" "What happened?" He stirred the broth. "Lost someone I couldn't save." The room fell into a stillness heavier than silence. When the soup was ready, Callum set a bowl before her. Serafina took it, her fingers brushing against his. She hadn't realized how cold her skin still was until that touch, brief but grounding. She tasted the first spoonful and exhaled slowly. Warmth spread through her chest, not just from the food, but from the presence of something she hadn't felt in a long time, being cared for without cost. Callum sat again across from her, arms crossed loosely. "I'll ask tomorrow," he said quietly, "about who you are, what you're running from." Serafina looked down. Fair enough. But tonight, he added, "You're safe. That's enough." At midnight, after she had fallen into a restless sleep beside the fire, Callum climbed the creaky stairs to Lyra's room. The door was cracked just enough for him to see her wide eyes. "She okay?" Lyra asked. "She's resting. She gonna stay?" Callum paused at the doorway. "For now." Lyra frowned. "She looks like someone who disappears." Callum walked over and sat at the edge of her bed. "Why do you say that?" "Because she doesn't know she's allowed to stay," Lyra said, her voice no louder than a breath. He didn't answer right away, just brushed a curl of hair from her face and whispered, "She's not the only one." Lyra closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she didn't dream of goodbyes. Downstairs, Serafina stirred. She dreamed of trees, of fire, of running. But in the center of it all was a small cabin glowing like a lighthouse, and a man who hadn't asked her name, only wrapped her in warmth and whispered that she was safe. In the gray stillness of dawn, the cabin seemed suspended between two worlds, one of fear that had followed Serafina through the pines, and another of fragile peace waiting to be rediscovered. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting soft shadows on the hand-hewn walls. A silence hung in the air, not hollow, but heavy with unspoken truths. Serafina sat up slowly, blinking into the dim morning. Her body ached. Her ankle throbbed dully. But more than the pain was the disorientation. Where am I? And why does it feel safer than any penthouse I've ever owned? She reached for the flannel jacket still draped around her shoulders and pulled it tight. For a brief moment, she let her eyes wander rough wood floorboards, shelves lined with jars of preserves, a battered bookshelf stacked with novels whose spines were worn with love. Everything in the cabin was functional. Nothing was luxurious. And yet for the first time in what felt like years, she did not feel like a product, or a headline, or a prize to be claimed. Footsteps creaked on the porch. She turned her head sharply, then relaxed when she saw Callum step inside carrying a small pile of chopped wood. He glanced at her without surprise. "You're up early," he said. Serafina's voice was still groggy. "Habit." He knelt by the hearth and stacked the new logs with care. "You were dreaming." Loudly. She flushed. "Sorry," he shrugged. "We all do. Some of us just don't remember." There it was again, his way of saying much with few words, not dismissive but distant. She wanted to ask what he had seen in her sleep, what she might have whispered in the dark, but something told her not to. Instead, she just watched him work. "Where's your daughter?" she asked gently. Callum looked toward the stairs. "Upstairs. She doesn't like strangers. Smart kid." He smiled faintly, the first sign of warmth she'd seen on his face. "She's been through a lot. Lost her mother 2 winters ago." Serafina's breath caught. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He placed a hand over the hearth, testing the warmth. "Lyra's. Careful now. Doesn't trust easily. I don't push her." Serafina nodded slowly. "Sounds familiar." Callum looked over at her, curious. "You too, I've learned." She said quietly that people only want what they think you can give them. The trick is, they never know what to do when all you can offer is who you really are. He studied her for a moment, then turned back to the fire. Maybe they never deserved to know. Upstairs, Lyra stood just beyond the stair rail, one hand curled around the banister. She had been listening. She didn't trust the woman. Not yet. But something in her voice, the softness, the tiredness, sounded like her father on the nights he thought Lyra was asleep and stared at the old picture of her mom for hours. By mid-morning, the sky had turned a soft winter blue. Callum prepared breakfast: eggs, potatoes, a slice of venison jerky cut thin and crisped in the skillet. Serafina offered to help, but he only handed her a fork and told her to sit. When they sat at the small table, Serafina noticed a third place set. She raised an eyebrow. For Lyra, Callum said simply, "Just in case." Minutes passed. Just as Serafina picked up her fork, a soft sound came from the stairs. Slippers against wood. Lyra appeared at the edge of the room, her hair tousled cheeks, pale and pink from the cold upstairs. Callum said nothing. He didn't motion her over. He simply nodded once gently. Lyra hesitated, eyes flicking to Serafina, with the guarded gaze of a child who'd learned loss too early. But then she walked slowly to the table, pulled out the chair, and sat. No words, no smiles, just presence. 3 people, 3 silences. But somehow, it was enough. Later that afternoon, while Callum went to the shed to repair a broken lantern, Serafina stepped outside. The air was cold but crisp, and she welcomed the bite on her skin. Lyra followed silently and stood beside her on the porch. Serafina didn't speak first. She let the quiet work its way in the way Callum seemed to do. Finally, Lyra said, "I heard you cry last night." Serafina turned her head, startled. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake. I didn't say I was mad." Lyra looked down at her boots. I know what that kind of crying is. The kind you do when you don't think anyone will ever come." Serafina's throat tightened. She crouched slowly to Lyra's level, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Did you ever feel like that?" Lyra nodded. "A lot. Until one night Daddy whispered to me that I wasn't alone. He didn't try to fix it, just said he was there. That's all." Serafina blinked back tears. "That's a pretty powerful whisper." Lyra looked up, eyes wide and clear. "It saved me." Then she pulled something from her pocket, a small pine cone perfectly shaped its scales, still closed tight. "It's not open yet," she said. "But sometimes when you leave it near the fire long enough, it starts to bloom." She placed it gently in Serafina's hand. "For when you're ready." That night, as the fire flickered low, Serafina held the pine cone in her palm, its rough edges pressed gently into her skin. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel like a woman who had been running or hiding or surviving. She felt seen. The snow began just before dusk. Outside the cabin, wind swept across the clearing in soft sighs, and the flakes fell slow and soundless like a blanket being pulled over the forest. Inside, Callum adjusted the damper on the stove, while Serafina sat cross-legged by the fire, slowly turning pages in a children's book she found tucked behind a row of old Reader's Digest novels. She wasn't reading. She was watching the stairs. All day Lyra had kept her distance, polite, quiet, never rude, but never truly near. Serafina understood it. She had spent most of her adult life learning to do the same, stay visible enough to be respected, invisible enough not to be touched. But something about the pine cone in her hand told her that little girls had a different kind of wisdom. Callum stood. "I'll be back in a bit." Lantern in the barns, still flickering, I think the oil wicks cracked. He glanced toward the stairs. "I won't be long." When the door shut behind him, Serafina sat very still. The fire crackled in uneven rhythm, and the light it cast danced across the floor in long orange ribbons. 10 minutes passed. Then footsteps. Soft. Careful. Lyra appeared on the third step from the bottom, wearing a thick knit sweater, far too big for her sleeves, swallowed her hands, and her eyes scanned the room like a cat stepping into an unfamiliar room. Serafina didn't speak. She didn't smile. She simply lifted the children's book in her lap and opened it gently, as if to a page she'd known for years. Her voice when it came was soft. Once upon a time, in a forest filled with pine trees and snow, there lived a girl who could hear things other people couldn't. Lyra tilted her head. She heard the sound of the trees breathing and the whispers of snowflakes falling. But most of all, she heard hearts. Not the beats, but the aching parts. Serafina glanced toward her. Lyra had taken another step. The girl was afraid of being hurt herself. She kept her thoughts in little jars buried in the forest ground, so no one could find them. Another step. But one night, Serafina continued voice. Just above the fire's hum, she heard someone else whispering. Not words, just warmth. And the jars she'd buried began to glow. Lyra stood just to the side of the hearth, now arms still folded sleeves down over her hands. She didn't speak, but her eyes told the story better than any page. Serafina closed the book. I used to hide too, she said. I didn't bury jars, but I did bury myself. Behind titles, behind walls. Lyra sat down carefully on the old rug in front of the fire. Close, but not touching. That's what people do, she said, when they think no one's looking for them. Serafina looked into the flames, heart aching at the clarity in the child's voice. Is that what you thought? She asked. Lyra nodded once. My mom got sick really fast. We didn't have time to say anything that mattered. Then she was gone. And Dad. He stopped talking after that. Serafina said nothing. She simply leaned forward and added a small log to the fire, watching it catch and swell. After a pause, Lyra said, He used to tell stories too. Before. Do you want him to tell them again? Lyra's voice dropped. I don't know. Serafina looked over gently. Sometimes the people who stop telling stories just need someone to remind them that it's okay to start again. Lyra looked down at her knees. Then quietly, she pulled her hand out of her sweater sleeve and slid something towards Serafina. It was a small, smooth river stone, white and round like a coin made of snow. On one side was a tiny, smiley face, drawn in faint pencil. I keep this when I feel sad, Lyra whispered. But I think you should borrow it tonight. Serafina swallowed hard, her vision blurring. Thank you, she said, her voice shaking. That's the kindest thing anyone's done for me in a very long time. Lyra nodded. You don't have to give it back right away. Just when you're ready. Callum returned to a quiet scene. The fire was bright, the air warm, and both girls, his daughter, and the woman he didn't yet understand, were sitting side by side, not speaking, not touching, but sharing a kind of stillness that hadn't existed in his home in over 2 years. Lyra stood up when she saw him. Hey, Dad. Yeah, will you read me a story tonight? Callum blinked. Then slowly he smiled. Of course. That night after Lyra had gone to bed with a book tucked beneath her pillow and the fire had grown low again, Serafina stood at the window, watching the snow fall. Callum stepped beside her. She's talking to you, he said. Serafina smiled faintly. She gave me her magic rock. He gave her a curious glance. It helps with sadness, apparently, she said. She told me I could borrow it. Callum's voice was quiet. She doesn't lend that to anyone. She said I could return it when I'm ready. He nodded. I hope you do. Not just the rock." Serafina looked at him. He met her gaze steadily. "I hope you return to whatever part of you went missing out there." For a moment, the only sound was the soft pop of a pine log splitting in the fire. Then she whispered, "Me too." It was snowing harder the next morning, thick, heavy flakes that softened the edges of the world. The kind of snow that silences sound, that makes everything feel slower, more intentional. Inside the cabin, Callum was repairing the leg of a rocking chair near the hearth, while Serafina stood at the sink, carefully drying plates from breakfast. She liked the rhythm of it, the gentleness of small tasks, the unspoken understanding between them. There was no performance here, no spotlight, just the quiet comfort of being useful to someone who didn't expect her to be anything else. From the open kitchen window, she caught a glimpse of Lyra outside, bundled in layers, her small boots leaving perfect prints across the white blanket of snow. "She's making her pine snow house," Callum said without looking up. "Says the squirrels need somewhere cozy." Serafina smiled and peered closer. Sure enough, Lyra was crouched near the base of a large pine, carefully arranging tiny sticks and moss. "She's really something," Serafina murmured. Callum paused. "She is. Smart. Gentle." "She didn't used to be gentle," he said quietly. Not right after." Serafina waited, sensing there was more. "She stopped speaking for almost 5 months after my wife passed," he continued. "Wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Wouldn't eat unless I sat with her. She started drawing pictures on the walls, chalk, mud, even crayon once. It was the only way she'd let anything out." He stood and stretched his arms, cracking his knuckles. "She's still learning how to let people in again. But she's watching you." Serafina dried her hands on a towel. "Watching me, she trusts slowly," he said. "But she learns by noticing who stays when it's hard." Later that afternoon, as the snow kept falling, Serafina joined Lyra by the fireplace. Callum had gone into town for supplies, and the cabin was quiet, except for the wind rustling the roof and the occasional creak of old wood. Lyra was coloring with a set of worn pencils, her brow furrowed in focus. Serafina sat on the rug beside her, giving space but not distance. "What are you drawing?" she asked gently. "A fox." Serafina leaned closer. The drawing showed a fox curled under a tree, eyes closed. Next to it was a smaller fox, wide-eyed and alert. "They look like they're waiting for something," Serafina said softly. "They're waiting for spring," Lyra replied. "So the little one doesn't have to be scared anymore." Serafina swallowed a sudden knot in her throat. Lyra added a few strokes of blue across the sky, then set the pencil down. She stared into the fire for a long time, her body very still. Then, out of nowhere, her shoulders began to shake. Serafina blinked, unsure at first what she was seeing, until Lyra let out a small, broken sob and buried her face in her arms. It was the kind of crying a child does when they've held too much too long. Serafina reached for her instinctively, but then paused. She remembered what it felt like when people had rushed to fix her grief too quickly. Instead, she inched closer, knelt beside Lyra, and whispered, "I'm here. Just here." Lyra turned and flung her arms around Serafina's waist, clutching tight her small hands, shaking. Serafina held her, rocked her gently, her own tears sliding silently down her cheek. No one had taught her how to comfort a child, but somewhere deep in her, beneath the layers of boardrooms and betrayals and bodyguards, something maternal stirred, fierce and warm. "I miss her," Lyra sobbed, "and I forget her voice sometimes. I hate that." Serafina cradled the girl against her chest. "It's okay to forget. That doesn't mean she's gone. You're still holding her in you. And I bet, if you sit quiet enough, her voice finds its way back." Lyra nodded against her. After a long time, her breathing evened out. When Callum returned later that evening, he found Lyra asleep on the rug, curled into Serafina's side, like a kitten tucked into sunlight. Serafina was leaning against the couch, her hand resting protectively over Lyra's shoulder, her eyes closed in quiet exhaustion. For a moment, he just stood there. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the two people he'd least expected to find under his roof begin to heal one another. He set the bags down quietly, stepped into the kitchen and began preparing dinner. The way he chopped the vegetables, slow, steady, careful, said more than any prayer could. That night, after Lyra had gone to bed and the fire had burned down to a low orange pulse, Callum poured 2 mugs of tea and handed one to Serafina. She took it gratefully. "She cried today," Serafina said softly. "Really cried." Callum didn't react at first. Then she hasn't done that in a long time. She held it in so long she forgot how to let it out. He nodded slowly. "Grief's like that," he said. "Stays quiet until it can't anymore." They sat in silence for a while. Then Serafina added, "She thinks the fox is waiting for spring." Callum looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "She's not wrong," he murmured. "Neither are you." Serafina turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He looked down at the mug in his hands, then back at her. "You came here like a storm. Hurt. Hunted. And somehow, you're the calm she didn't know she needed. That's not something you can fake." She didn't know what to say to that. So instead, she whispered, "Do you think I'll know when it's spring?" Callum looked her in the eye. "I think you'll hear it in her laugh, before you ever feel it in the air." The snowfall ended sometime in the early morning. When Serafina stepped outside just after sunrise, the forest looked like it had been made new. The world was hushed, and pristine trees, standing tall under the weight of snow, the clearing blanketed in white, untouched, except for a set of small tracks leading away from the cabin. Lyra's tracks. Serafina wrapped Callum's old jacket tighter around her as she followed the trail. It led down the gentle slope behind the house to the edge of a frozen creek, where sunlight filtered through the pine canopy and shimmered across the surface like glass. Lyra was crouched at the edge, her breath puffing visibly as she scraped gently at a mound of snow with a small stick. "I didn't mean to wake you," the girl said without turning around. "You didn't," Serafina replied. "Couldn't sleep." Lyra continued her gentle digging, her tone curious. "You ever keep something and then forget why it mattered? Until you lose it." The question caught Serafina off guard. "I think I've built a life out of doing exactly that," she said honestly. There was a silence between them, not heavy, just thoughtful. Lyra lifted something from the snow. A small silver disc, dented slightly but still whole. She brushed it off and held it out. Serafina stepped forward and stared. It was her mother's locket. Her hands trembled as she took it. The clasp was bent, and the chain had snapped, but the engraving on the back was unmistakable. "To SV for the light you carry." Her breath caught. "Where did you find this?" Lyra shrugged. "It was frozen under the leaves yesterday. I kept it in the firewood bin so it wouldn't get lost again." Serafina turned it over in her hands, heart thudding. The last time she'd worn this, it had been around her neck during that final conversation, before the crash, before the betrayal, before she became a fugitive in the woods. She remembered yanking it off when it got tangled in her seatbelt. After that, nothing. And now it had returned, just as she was beginning to feel like a different woman. Lyra watched her. "Did it belong to someone you loved?" "Yes," Serafina whispered. "My mom. She died when I was your age." Lyra's eyes dropped. "That's too young." Serafina nodded. "It is." Lyra said nothing more, but then slowly she reached for Serafina's hand, and gently closed her fingers around the locket. "You should fix it. Keep it close again." Back in the cabin, Callum was standing at the window watching them. He hadn't asked where Serafina had gone, but something in his posture softened when he saw Lyra's hand tucked in hers. When they entered, he greeted them with coffee and oatmeal. Nothing fancy, but real and warm, and enough to make the morning feel anchored. Serafina sat with the locket beside her bowl. Callum noticed, but didn't comment. "I need your help with something," she said after breakfast. Callum raised an eyebrow. "Something mechanical." He smirked. "Well, that narrows it down." She held out the locket. "The clasp is broken. I want to wear it again." Callum took the piece, gently examined it. "Can't promise a miracle." Serafina smiled faintly. "I've already had one. Just need a little reinforcement." He nodded and set to work at the table using a set of old jeweler's tools and a magnifier he pulled from a drawer. Serafina watched him as he worked. Hands steady, movements precise. The same man who once said he didn't save people was now carefully piecing together the last thing Serafina had from the woman who gave her life and taught her how to live it. That afternoon, while Callum split wood out back, Serafina sat beside the fireplace, turning the locket slowly in her hand. Lyra came downstairs and curled beside her without a word. After a moment, Serafina asked, "Do you think people can change?" Lyra tilted her head. "Like, become someone new, no. Like, go back and fix something they broke inside." Lyra picked up the pine cone she had given Serafina days earlier and examined it carefully. The scales were starting to crack open. "I think if you stay close enough to the fire," she said, "things open when they're ready." Serafina stared at her. That kind of wisdom didn't come from cartoons or fairy tales. That came from grief and growth and surviving something without letting it swallow you. She reached out and brushed a lock of hair from Lyra's cheek. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," she said quietly. Lyra gave a small smile. "You're not bad either," she said. "For a grown-up." That evening, after Lyra had gone to bed, Serafina stood near the fire holding the locket, now restored and shining. She turned to Callum. "Why did you fix it?" He leaned back in the chair, sipping tea. "Because you asked." "No," she said. "That's not it." Callum set the mug down and looked up at her, the flames dancing in his eyes. "Because some things are worth keeping, even if they are dented, even if they got lost for a while." Serafina took a step closer. The distance between them wasn't wide, but the space it had once represented the walls, the wounds, the fear was slowly collapsing. "I think I'm starting to believe that," she said softly. He gave a small nod. "I'm glad." And as she turned to the fire once more, the locket warm against her chest, she whispered aloud, though not to him, not to herself, to her mother, to the girl she had been, to the woman she was becoming. "I'm still here, and I'm still holding the light." The wind changed that night. It carried with it the scent of distant pine smoke and the faint creak of branches weighed down by snow. Inside the cabin, the fire pulsed steadily, casting waves of golden warmth that danced across the wood floors and faded quilts. Callum had gone to the shed again this time to patch a leaky oil tank before the temperature dropped further. Serafina had insisted he let her handle the dishes after dinner so he could finish before dark. Lyra was upstairs, unusually quiet. Too quiet. Serafina dried the last plate and glanced at the staircase. Something twisted low in her stomach. She turned toward the hearth to tend the fire, but the silence upstairs grew louder, a kind of stillness that no parent, no caretaker could ever mistake for peace. Then it came. A muffled gasp, a sharp, hoarse cough, followed by another. Serafina dropped the towel. By the time she reached the top of the stairs, Lyra was sitting upright in bed, arms wrapped around her chest, coughing so violently It shook her frame. Her eyes were red, wide with panic, and her face glistened with tears. Lyra Serafina whispered, pushing forward, "Hey, hey, it's okay! You're okay!" But Lyra wasn't okay. The coughing was deep-cutting. Serafina slid in beside her on the bed and pulled the girl into her arms, steadying her. "It hurts," Lyra choked. I can't." "Shh," Serafina whispered, rocking gently. "You're not alone. I'm right here." She grabbed the glass of water from the nightstand and held it to Lyra's lips. The girl sipped, coughed again, then buried her face in Serafina's shoulder, like she had nowhere else left in the world to hide. And maybe she didn't. Serafina rubbed her back in small circles over and over her own chest, tightening with every ragged breath Lyra took. "Breathe with me, sweetheart. In and out, just like waves." Her voice dropped into a rhythm low and steady. In and out. It took time, but the storm inside Lyra's lungs began to calm. When the coughing faded to hiccuped breaths and trembling exhales, Serafina leaned back, brushing the hair from the girl's damp forehead. Lyra was still crying, though now the tears were different, not from the cough, but from the weight of something deeper, something older. "I was scared," she whispered. "I thought it was happening again." Serafina paused. What was Lyra looked up at her cheeks wet. "When Mom died, she coughed like that too. And I didn't do anything. I just sat there." Serafina's breath caught. "Oh, Lyra, you were just a little girl. I didn't even say goodbye." Lyra choked. "I didn't even tell her I loved her." Serafina wrapped both arms around her and held her tightly. She knew. I promise you she knew. Lyra sobbed into her chest. But what if I forget her voice? What if I already have Serafina closed her eyes, a single tear escaping down her cheek? You might forget her voice, Lyra, but you'll never forget the way it made you feel. The girl stilled, listening. She loved you with everything she had. That kind of love. It doesn't leave. It becomes the voice inside you when you're scared, the warmth when you're cold, the whisper that says you're strong enough. Lyra leaned in closer, the sobs finally fading to silence. They stayed like that for a long while, heartbeats sinking. Callum returned just before midnight. The snow had started again, falling fast and soundless. He pushed the door open, shaking flakes from his shoulders, and froze. On the staircase, lit only by the flickering fire, stood Serafina, barefoot, holding a blanket. "She's asleep," Serafina said softly. "But it was bad tonight." She thought it was happening again. Callum's face shifted, grief flickering like a candle behind his eyes. "I should have been here." "No," Serafina said gently. "You gave her the space to live. She needed that. She also needed someone to catch her when she fell. Tonight that happened to be me." She stepped forward, her eyes tender. "She talked about your wife." Callum nodded, his jaw clenched. "She remembers more than you think," Serafina added. "But she's scared of forgetting, too." He looked up at her, the pain so open, so unguarded it nearly broke her. "I am too," he admitted. "I forget her laugh some days." Serafina didn't respond with words. She simply reached out and placed a hand on his chest over his heart. "It's still in here," she whispered. "You just needed someone to help you hear it again." Later, as Serafina returned to her room, she noticed something lying on her pillow. It was the small river stone Lyra had once given her, the one with the smiley face now, with a single new line sketched beside it. A second smiley face, a little smaller. Underneath in soft pencil, "You helped me breathe. Love, Lyra." Serafina stared at it for a long time. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, held the stone in her hand, and whispered the words that had been echoing in her chest all night. "You're not alone." She had said them for Lyra, but maybe she'd needed to hear them too. The sky had cleared by morning, leaving a pale sun dangling over the pine ridge like a forgotten ornament. Icicles clung to the eaves of the cabin, catching light in slow dripping prisms. Everything shimmered, but nothing moved. Inside, Serafina stood in front of the small mirror above the sink, twisting the repaired locket gently in her fingers. She hadn't worn it in years. Not since her mother's funeral. Back then, it had felt too heavy to carry. Now it felt like a thread connecting who she used to be with the woman she might still become. She closed the clasp behind her neck, took a breath, and turned toward the living room. Callum sat by the fire reading a worn paperback with half the cover missing. Lyra had gone outside to scatter seeds for birds, something she did every time it snowed, in case they forget how to find food, she'd explained. Serafina stood in the doorway watching him for a moment. "Can we talk?" she said. He looked up. Something in her voice, carefully leveled, but taut, made him set the book down. "Sure." She stepped closer, then stopped just shy of the hearth. The fire popped softly between them. "There's something I haven't told you," she began. "Something important." Callum said nothing, but the quiet in the room changed. Not cold, not suspicious, just attentive. "I wasn't in the woods by accident," she said. "What happened to me was planned." He didn't move, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Planned." She nodded. "The plane crash, the people chasing me. It wasn't a robbery. It was an attempt to disappear me." The words hung between them like ice that hadn't broken yet. "Because of who you are?" Callum asked. Serafina exhaled. "Yes." And then with quiet clarity, "My name is Serafina Voss." Callum blinked once, then again. "You're," he paused. "The tech person. The billionaire." She gave a faint, tired smile. "That's what the headlines say." He leaned back, slowly studying her. Not with awe, not with judgment, but with something heavier, the weight of reevaluating a person you thought you knew and realizing you might have only scratched the surface. "You've been here almost 2 weeks, he said finally. "And you didn't tell me." "I couldn't," she said, voice tightening. It wasn't just about hiding. It was about remembering what it feels like to not be someone's asset or liability, just a person. He nodded once slowly. "I get that," he said. "More than you know." Serafina stepped closer, pulling the locket from under her sweater. "This used to belong to my mother. She gave it to me the year before she passed. I wore it every day until I didn't know who I was anymore. Then I stopped." She opened it. Inside a tiny time-worn photo, her as a child, maybe 6 years old, sitting on her mother's lap. Both laughing, unposed, alive. "I was building something big when I lost it all," she whispered. "Not just the company, my compass, my faith in people, myself." Callum watched her carefully. "And now," she looked up. "I want it back. Not the empire, just the truth, the kind that doesn't need an audience." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stood and walked to the window. Outside, Lyra was spinning slowly in the snowface, lifted to the sky. "She trusts you," Callum said softly. "I trust her," Serafina replied. He turned back to her. "And me." Serafina's breath hitched. "I didn't think I could trust anyone again," she said honestly. "But then you carried me through the woods like I mattered, and you didn't even know my name." He held her gaze for a moment longer. "Then I didn't need to know it." Her eyes shimmered. "Why?" He took a slow breath. "Because I saw it in your face. You looked like someone who hadn't been seen in a very long time, and I know what that feels like." The fire crackled between them. Then Serafina asked, "Do you regret helping me?" Callum stepped forward just enough to close the space between them. "No," he said quietly. "I regret not doing it sooner." She blinked. "I don't understand." He smiled barely. "I stopped saving people. After what happened to my wife. I couldn't do it. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid I'd fail again." She reached for his hand. Their fingers met halfway. "You didn't fail this time," she whispered. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It pulsed with something growing, something warm and slow and unmistakably alive. That night, Serafina lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. A part of her wanted to run again, to disappear before the outside world discovered she was still alive. But another part, louder, now wanted to stay, to fight. Not with fury, but with truth, to reclaim her name not for power, but for peace. She sat up, pulled her journal from the drawer, and began to write for the first time in months. "Tonight I told the truth, not to protect myself, not to win, just to be free." And someone stayed. In the room next door, Callum sat beside Lyra's bed, watching her sleep. He reached out and brushed a stray curl from her forehead. He whispered softly words he hadn't said in too long. "You're not alone, kiddo. You never were." And somewhere across the thin cabin walls, another whisper echoed back. A truth held, a fear released, a beginning born again. The drive into town was silent, but not empty. Callum sat at the wheel, eyes focused on the road hand steady. Beside him, Serafina stared out the window, watching the forest thin into telephone poles and scattered rooftops. Snow had turned to slush in the gutters, and the sky was heavy with early spring gray. She wore no makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot. Around her neck hung the repaired locket, its weight now familiar. In the back seat, Lyra fidgeted with a notebook and a small digital camera. Her boots swung just above the floor, mismatched socks peeking out from beneath her jeans. She had insisted on coming. Because if you're going to change something, she'd said, you should have people who know your heart in the room. Serafina hadn't argued. She was done pretending she could do this alone. The building was glass and steel and too many stories high. A monument to ambition she had once designed with pride. Her name had been etched across the front wall, Voss Technologies, until a month ago, when the board had voted to remove it, claiming she was incommunicado and mentally compromised. They hadn't known she'd survived. They hadn't counted on her healing in silence, and they definitely hadn't prepared for the girl who walked back in not as a ghost, but as a flame. The boardroom was full by the time she entered. Suits, cameras, lawyers, shareholders. And at the head of the table sat Travis Kincaid, her former COO, now interim CEO. Polished, ambitious, calculated. His expression shifted when he saw her. Not shock, fear, masked quickly as formality. Well, he said, standing, look, who I'll speak first. Serafina said, her voice clear. The room stilled. She stepped to the front of the room, placing a single flash drive on the table. It's all there, she said. Every email, every asset trail, every meeting log, including the ones that show exactly how you rerouted my private flight path and diverted funds while I was unconscious. A murmur broke out. Travis forced a laugh. You've been through a traumatic. You tried to erase me, she said, her voice sharper now. But what you failed to understand is I don't vanish when you stop saying my name. I exist. I endure. And now I speak. She turned to the crowd. I didn't come back for vengeance, she said. I came back for the people who helped build this, who were lied to, pushed out, and silenced. I came back for the young women in tech who think they have to choose between their minds and their safety. I came back because healing in the dark only works if you walk into the light. From the back of the room, Lyra raised her camera and clicked. A soft shutter, a small sound. but it felt like thunder in Serafina's chest. After the presentation, Serafina stepped outside into the courtyard. She felt raw and steady at once, like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. Callum was waiting by the fountain, a paper coffee cup in each hand. He handed one to her. "Did you burn it down?" he asked. She took a sip. "No. I just told the truth loud enough that the wall shook." He gave a small smile. "Even better." They stood in silence for a moment. Then she turned to him. "I want to give something back, not just to fix what happened, but to build something better." He nodded, already sensing where her thoughts were going. "I'd like to fund a program," she continued, "a retreat for girls like Lyra, for women who've been broken and told they don't get to come back." Callum's eyes softened. "You'll need land, people." "I have the money," she said, "but I need the heart, and that's here, in your cabin, in that child, in the way you fixed my mother's locket without asking for anything in return." He looked down, quiet. "You changed something in me," she said. "I want to give that forward." That night, back at the cabin, Lyra was lying on her bed, sketching. Serafina sat nearby, watching the fire flicker in the stove across the room. "What did it feel like?" Lyra asked suddenly. Serafina looked over. "What, standing in front of all those people, saying what no one else could?" Serafina considered the question. "It felt like opening a window I'd nailed shut a long time ago," she said, "and realizing I could still breathe." Lyra nodded. "I want to be like that." Serafina smiled. "You already are." Lyra rolled over and handed her a drawing. It was a woman standing on a hill, arms outstretched, a pine tree behind her, and just above, in the corner of the page, a little girl standing with a camera. "You saw me," Serafina whispered. Lyra looked up. "You let me." Later, as Serafina prepared for bed, she held the locket in her hand, not out of grief, but gratitude. Because somewhere between the trees and the firelight, the silence and the truth, she had stopped surviving and started becoming. Spring arrived as if it had been waiting for permission. Snow still lingered in the shadows beneath the trees, but the air no longer bit. The creek behind the cabin began to trickle again, its icy silence melting into soft, gurgling life. Buds curled from the tips of maple branches, hesitant but certain. Serafina stood barefoot on the porch, her toes grazing the damp wood. In her hands, she held a mug of tea, Callum's technically, but he always seemed to hand her the one with the chipped rim. Inside, Lyra was drawing again. More foxes, Serafina guessed, or perhaps something new. These days, the girl's sketches had started to change. Less waiting, more leaping. Callum stepped outside and leaned against the railing beside her. He'd just finished repairing the old wind chime above the door, its gentle tones now humming with every breeze. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then Callum spoke. She smiled at the grocery store yesterday. Serafina looked over, surprised. "Lyra!" He nodded. "At the cashier. First time I've seen her do that in 2 years. And it wasn't forced." Serafina felt warmth rise behind her ribs. She's starting to believe in the world again. Callum tilted his head, eyes soft. "Maybe we all are." That afternoon, the three of them walked down the trail behind the cabin. The air was filled with the scent of thawing earth and pine needles. Birds had returned to the trees, tentative and bright. Callum carried a small toolkit, Lyra a backpack filled with ribbon tacks and paper hearts. Serafina carried a folded wooden sign. At the edge of the clearing, just past the place where the old woodshed once stood, they stopped. "Here?" Serafina asked. Lyra nodded firmly. "It's where we found spring." They set to work, Callum anchoring the signpost, Serafina steadying the base. Lyra fluttering around them with bursts of color and childlike certainty. When it was done, the sign read, "Welcome home, a place for those who remember how to begin." Below it, Lyra had drawn a fox and a pine cone, and beneath that, in her careful print, "This place was built by whispers." That evening back at the cabin, Callum stood in the kitchen flipping pancakes. He'd told Serafina once that he made them on hard days. When the world feels too sharp, pancakes take the edge off. Tonight, there was no edge, only softness. Serafina set the table humming something she hadn't thought of in years, a lullaby her mother used to hum when combing her hair. Lyra joined in, not knowing the words, but following the melody. After dinner, they lingered around the table. Callum poured tea. Lyra begged for just 5 more minutes before bed. "You said that 5 minutes ago," he teased. "But this time, I mean it," she said, grinning. Serafina laughed a sound she didn't recognize as her own at first. It came from deeper now, less polished, more honest. Later, as moonlight slipped across the floorboards, Callum stood at the threshold of Serafina's room. She was sitting by the window, the repaired locket in her hand. "I couldn't sleep," she said. He stepped inside, leaned against the doorframe. "Me neither." She looked up at him. "What now?" He crossed the room slowly, deliberately, and sat in the chair across from her. "Now," he echoed. "Now you rest. You build. You make space for the next person who thinks they're beyond saving." Serafina studied him. "And you?" Callum met her gaze without flinching. "I think I might have already been saved," he said quietly. "Just didn't notice until you walked out of the woods." A beat passed. Then she reached for his hand. "You didn't just carry me through the forest," she whispered. "You carried me out of everything I was afraid to face." He squeezed her fingers gently. "And you held my daughter when I couldn't find the words." Serafina blinked back tears. "I didn't expect this," she admitted. "Not any of it." Callum smiled. "The good things, they usually come when you stop expecting and just start noticing." They sat in the quiet, the hum of night wrapping around them like a quilt. Then Serafina asked, barely audible, "Do you think it's okay to feel happy?" Even after everything, Callum didn't hesitate. "I think it's necessary." Before they went to bed, Serafina stepped into Lyra's room. The girl stirred, but didn't fully wake. Serafina tucked the blanket up under her chin and whispered, "I love you." It slipped out so naturally she didn't realize she'd said it, until Lyra, half asleep, mumbled, "I love you too." And just like that, it was real. In the cabin beneath the pines, the one once held together by silence, grief, and whispered survival. A new sound took hold that night. Laughter. Light footsteps, the beginning of a second chance. A year later, the cabin looked almost the same, but nothing about it was untouched. The porch had been rebuilt wider now with handmade benches and soft yellow cushions. A new coat of paint covered the front door, though the scuff near the bottom, where Lyra always kicked off her boots, remained untouched, like a signature no one wanted to erase. The wind chimes still rang, but there were more of them now, each one sent from women who had stayed here, each one tuned slightly differently, like a chorus of healing carried on the breeze. Serafina stood near the woodpile locket at her collarbone sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hands were dirty from the garden, and she hadn't worn heels in nearly 10 months. The sun was warm on her face. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of pine, rosemary, and distant bread rising in the kitchen. "So this is what staying looks like," she whispered. Behind her, Callum appeared, a mug in one hand and a slow smile in his eyes. "Coffee," he offered. She took it gratefully. "Any visitors today?" he asked. "3, she said. 1 from Michigan, 1 from Oregon, and a girl from Maine who arrived on the night bus. She brought her own blanket and a book of poetry she wrote after her sister passed. Callum nodded. She'll fit right in. They stood in silence, looking out at the clearing. The wooden sign Lyra had painted still stood slightly faded, but no less true. Welcome home, a place for those who remember how to begin. Inside, Lyra was sitting at the long dining table with two other girls, showing them how to fold paper cranes. Her voice was calm, steady, with the tone of someone who once needed comfort, and now knew how to give it. A dog lay curled under her feet, a rescue mutt they'd adopted last fall. Its name was Whisper. Serafina stepped inside and paused at the doorway. She watched as Lyra reached for a girl's hand, who had started to cry without warning. The girl couldn't have been more than 13, her face pale and fragile. Lyra didn't flinch. She didn't say, "Don't cry." She just nodded, pressed a paper crane into her palm and whispered, "You don't have to explain. You're here, that's enough." Serafina blinked fast. She would never stop being astonished by that child. That evening, the community gathered around the fire pit, something they did every Saturday. A tradition Serafina hadn't planned, but which grew naturally like moss on stone. People brought stories instead of offerings, scars instead of small talk. Callum played guitar, badly but earnestly. Lyra read aloud from her journal, and Serafina, when asked, told the story of a woman who had once walked barefoot through snow, bleeding afraid and broken, and been carried not just by a man, but by a whisper she hadn't known how to believe in. They didn't clap when she finished. They just sat in the warmth of it, the truth of it, and that was more than enough. Later that night, as the cabin quieted and guests retreated to their rooms, Serafina wandered out alone to the shed behind the clearing, not the old storage shed that had collapsed in the spring storm. This one was new, built with care, topped with a small skylight. She stepped inside and flicked on the light. The walls were covered in photographs, drawings, letters, and folded paper cranes. A memory archive, a living journal of every woman, child, and soul who had come through these doors and remembered something vital, that they mattered. On a small table in the center was a journal, open to the first page. Serafina picked it up and smiled. It read, "I wasn't saved in a hospital. I wasn't saved in a courtroom. I was saved in a cabin beneath the trees. A man carried me through a forest and never asked my name. A child gave me a stone when I thought I had nothing left to hold, and in the silence of a place where no one demanded I prove my worth, I heard the whisper that brought me back to life." Her eyes blurred. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. This wasn't a retreat. It wasn't a refuge. It was a miracle. One born not of spectacle but of kindness, of listening, of staying, of holding each other through the storm. She stepped outside into the starlight. Callum was waiting by the porch, holding 2 mugs again. Lyra was already curled on the porch swing, asleep beneath a knit blanket, her chest rising and falling with quiet certainty. Serafina joined him, took the mug, and leaned into his side. He kissed her temple gently and whispered, "You didn't just come back. You built something no one can take away." She looked out at the trees. "I didn't do it alone." He smiled. The best things never are. They sat there in the stillness, no longer afraid of silence. Above them, the wind moved through the chimes. And somewhere in the trees, the last of the snow melted not into water, but into memory. If this story touched something quiet in your heart, I'd love to know. Where are you watching from today? It's always beautiful to see how far stories like this can travel, and how many souls they quietly reach. If you'd like to hear more stories about love, redemption, and the quiet miracles that still happen in this world, feel free to subscribe, only if it feels right to you. There's always a seat by the fire here, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you for spending this time with me. Your presence means more than you know. Until next time, take good care of your heart.